Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the Fly podcast with Param. Hello, Param. So, we captured the big picture about this new GMAT Focus edition in part 1. Link is in the description, fellas. So, in this part, let's dive deep. Now, Param, you have mentored candidates, for the Focus edition as well as the regular GMAT. So
Mm-hmm.
let's look at it from two ways. One from an exam taker's perspective, how similar or how different was the examination
Mm-hmm.
experience for people? And number two, from a preparation
Mm-hmm.
perspective, what skills are tested in this new focus edition? Perhaps, you walked us through the different sections in part one. Maybe elaborate on that.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So, as I mentioned, or as we discussed in part one, that there are a lot of changes which seem to make the GMAT focus look easier on the surface, look sleeker on the surface, and therefore make it more palatable to the Indian audience or to the Asian audience. The reality of the matter is the exam still remains as difficult as before, right? For example, although quant now has, let's say, the 99th percentile and percentiles beyond the 96th percentile, which used to be the max in GMAT Classic, the fact of the matter is that one incorrect question in the quant section brings that percentile down to a 90th percentile, right, for the quant section. So the scoring is pretty, well, I would say it's more or less the same in terms of the individual sectional percentiles, right?
Hmm.
Now, although the verbal section does not have sentence correction and therefore it might seem okay, then the preparation becomes easier. But consider this. Earlier, there used to be 36 questions on the verbal section for which we were allocated 65 minutes, for which a test taker was allocated 65 minutes. That roughly translated into 108 seconds per question, 1 minute, 48 seconds a question. Now we have got 23 questions, 45 minutes, so that's a bit more than 108 seconds, roughly 116 seconds. The last I calculated, 116 or 117. But then consider that 13 odd questions that are now dropped, they were effectively sentence correction questions. So although sentence correction does take a bit more time to prepare, those are the questions that you can solve in within 1 minute, 1 minute 10, 1 minute 20 seconds. Because ultimately, if you're comfortable with the grammar and if you're able to apply the different grammatical rules, the process of elimination is pretty straightforward. At the end of the day, you're just reading one sentence, right? Whereas now, all you're going to be dealing with on the paper is going to be passages and more passages, right? I mean, it's just, pick your poison sort of thing. It's either a short passage or a long passage, but it's all passages. And then you have to understand the passage in depth, eliminate the options individually on the basis of, certain ideas such as extreme words beyond the scope, ideas which, we cover. But basically, the point is that it's not really easier in the sense that people are trying to, paint it as or visualize it as, right? Beg your pardon. Now, from the test taker's experience, yes, it is true that the test taker would feel a lot less strained by the time they have finished the exam, simply because it's a matter of stamina, right? People feel more comfortable sitting through the exam for 2 hours as opposed to sitting through the exam for 3 hours. But as we have seen that if people try to write the exam too early, that is a classic GMAT course would, let's say, require 3 months of classes and another 3 months of test taking, mock analysis, timed practice, followed by more analysis, right? So it would all in all be at least a 6 month endeavor, right? Which is why we have kept our course length the same of 3 months, or a little bit lower than that, roughly 2 months. But again, the point is that that additional amount of time is still required for analysis because we have seen that people who write the exam too early or who have attempted to write the exam too early, let's say within a month of completing their classes, there is nothing else to prepare or this is all that there is, they often struggle on the actual exam, especially in the DI section, right? Because in integrated reasoning, earlier people didn't used to prepare for it, and they would get a 6 or 7 out of 8 pretty comfortably, right? Now, when it's part of the marked scaled score, right? The perception or the psychology is quite different. That is, unless you have practiced a certain volume of questions, unless you have been exposed to the really advanced level of questions, right? Because now IR or DI is also question adaptive. So unless you have been exposed to such a variety of questions, you're bound to struggle under a timed environment when you know it's the actual thing, right? I mean, you can play 20 balls in the net and then prepare for a T20 game. But ideally, you should prepare for a T20 game in the same way that you do for an ODI or for a test match, right? I mean, just because it's a T20 game does not mean that, all of a sudden you can reduce the amount of time or reduce the amount of practice that you put in towards the test because, you are going to be exposed to those tricky conditions and the time management will always be an issue. I mean, in quant, it won't be an issue. In quant, it never was an issue, at least for an Indian engineer, which most of the GMAT market base is. The quant section is never a challenge. Verbal section, the time management issues will remain unless enough practice has been put into the process, right? Same goes for DI as well. I mean, you have basically got 45 minutes and you have got 20 questions, right? But then they are not really 20 questions because you have got multi-source reasoning where each question is comprised of three parts, right? And all parts have to be answered correctly for you to get a full point on that question, right? Similarly, you've got two-part analysis wherein each question is effectively two questions and you have to make correct selections in both. Otherwise, you end up getting that question incorrect. So all in all, you're actually looking at roughly 30 to 35 odd questions, which have to be done or which have to be completed in 45 minutes. And that's an entirely different ball game altogether. Now, it's a different sort of mindset. If you know that that section is unmarked, and then, you're just solving questions for the fun of it. But as soon as that realization kicks in that this is very much part of my scaled score, then all of a sudden you're approaching the question differently, you're comprehending it differently. And then what will bail you out in such cases will be the pattern recognition, the dedicated practice that you have put in, the understanding of the different concept types, the understanding of what exactly is being tested in a certain question type. For the verbal section, I can speak a bit more. For example, in critical reasoning, the understanding of different logical frameworks, right? The understanding of how to approach an inference question type, what sort of options or traps to avoid. And all in all, it's really pattern recognition, which is grounded in mathematical logic and formal logic across the entire paper, whether it be DI or whether it be quant or whether it be the verbal section. So the skill sets required are still very much the same. In fact, a lot of people actually lament the scrapping of the SC section because that was a section where you could actually save more time in verbal, right? And verbal does contribute more to the overall score any which way. That also we have seen through our test takers. People who score high in verbal and data insights, their scaled composite is always going to be greater than if someone scores high in the quant and DI section, for example, or just the quant section alone. So at least two of the three sections have to be performed solidly, and those two sections would generally be verbal and DI. So it's basically the same logic that everybody is going to do well on the quant section any which way, right? So the quant section sort of still loses its importance as compared to the verbal and DI sections.
So are we looking at a different approach, a preparation timelines, resource requirements for this new GMAT focus editions with these, hidden changes in place?
Right. And the thing is, not really. I mean, the only thing that we can sort of infer is that maybe the preparation will be reduced by 15 to 20%, right? Where it would take 6 months. Now, maybe the standard preparation time could be 4.5 to 5 months, right? From the date you start your GMAT prep, right? But then one should always be aware of taking the exam too lightly. Because people often think, and this is a general tendency, that, well, so much stuff has been removed, so the exam must be easier. and there is nothing to study for. And that's absolutely not true. Earlier, people would think CR and RC were easier, but that was only because SC was more of the challenging section, right? Now, when CR and RC become the only two sections that are going to be scored, it's absolutely crucial to ensure that we understand every ounce of formal mathematical logical reasoning that goes into a particular question, for example. So now we cannot, for instance, say, okay, this question I might have missed, but there are bigger fish to fry, because there are no bigger fish to fry. This is the fish to fry, right? So earlier, where people could ignore certain question types, maybe simply because there was a huge amount of material to cover, the con of having less material to cover also means that those materials have to be covered more in depth, and also because the number of questions reduces, right? The chances of making too many mistakes also reduce, correct? Earlier, for example, we had 31 and 36 questions in quant and verbal, of which three were experimental in quant and six were experimental in verbal. So you could make a few more mistakes and not be penalized in the same manner. Now, with the dearth of questions, almost 21 in quant and 23 in verbal and 20 in DI, the number of questions on which you can make mistakes reduces, right? And because that error margin is a lot lower, therefore, your skill level has to be a lot higher, right? Earlier, where, for example, one could do with a 75 to 80% accuracy, now that same changes to 85 to 90% even, right? For a competitive 94th, 95th percentile score, if somebody is aiming for the ISP, let's say, right? So in that way, it's really, a trade-off that has resulted in between the percentage accuracy or the level of conceptual clarity that you need to have for a certain question type or a certain set of questions versus the amount of material that has to be covered. Earlier, the amount of material was greater, so the percentage accuracy could have been a little lower. Of course, it couldn't have been too much, be below the 75% accuracy rate. Now, the amount of material has gone down quite significantly, but so what is the counter side, or what is on the other side of the ledger, as it were? Well, the accuracy percentage has to go up, right? So in effect, the amount of preparation time should not really change too drastically, although in theory, I could see it being reduced by maybe a month. So probably a 16% reduction if we were being mathematically precise, from let's say a standard prep time of 6 months to a standard prep time of 5 months. But people or test takers should not make the mistake of reducing it from 6 months to 2 months or 3 months, right? The amount of practice needed would be greater if the syllabus has reduced.
So we had quite the detailed chat on the new GMAT Focus edition. So
Hmm.
let's wrap this up with one for the candidates. What are some of the common mistakes that the candidates make, let's say during the preparation process or during the exam itself? Yes,
Hmm.
sir.
Mhm. Well, I mean, it could be a host of mistakes, but for example, one very common mistake that I've seen my students make, especially with the Focus edition coming out, is that they somehow tend to think that the exam is easier in some way, right? What they have to understand is, although the syllabus has reduced, right, so has the number of questions, right? Now, of course, one pro to that is that you won't feel as tired during the exam. But what is the flip side? Well, the flip side is that the accuracy rate has to be really, really solid, right? And well, I posit that if somebody is scoring at a 99th or a 100th percentile on the GMAT Focus edition, he or she would still feel very much the same level of tiredness as he or she would have had she attempted the classic GMAT and scored a 99th percentile, right? Because you have to concentrate more. DI is all about reading plus mathematical analysis as well. For the verbal section, now 23 questions, all of them would involve reading, along with elimination of options. Quant, maybe not so much reading, but even on the quant section, as your audience would know, nowadays there are quite a few word problems, right? So they won't give you just standard, straight up equations or inequalities, but they would actually phrase that in the form of a paragraph. And then you have to decode the paragraph to arrive at the equation or the inequality and then solve the equation or inequality, right? So that is one common mistake that people make quite often, that they somehow perceive the exam as being significantly easier than the classic GMAT, right? And therefore the mindset is, okay, now I'll allocate 2 months to GMAT prep, and I will allocate the rest of my time to the application process, and therefore we are on track, right? And that definitely should not be the process, right? I mean, 2 months is what we have for our classes alone. And along with that, it should be at least another 2 to 2.5 months for timed practice, analysis of doubts, right? Get your doubts sorted in sessions, write mocks, at least 8 to 10 mocks before, the average scores indicate whether you're prepared to write the exam. Analyze those mocks by your mentors, which are all of the things we focus on during our courses as well. That is, we ensure that people are not taking the exam too lightly. The second thing is, the second mistake, which I've often seen people make nowadays, is they simply don't practice enough, right? Because, as an engineer, we often tend to think कि quant ho hi jayega, right? We often tend to think that quant is easy. DI is mainly quant. Without practicing too much, we do 10 to 20 odd questions. And verbal, well, it's mainly CAT because now it's just reading comprehension. So everything will be hunky-dory, right? And nothing could be farther from the truth because CAT at the end of the day is a quant-oriented exam, right? This is one important difference, that if you're good in quant, and even if you're slightly weaker in verbal, you can still get a very good CAT percentile, right? Because quant and LIDR would come to your rescue, for example. On the GMAT, that is not an option. Even though sentence correction has gone, the verbal section still contributes or will contribute a huge proportion to your overall score. For example, earlier on the GMAT Classic, if somebody scored a Q47, which was the 59th percentile in quant, and a V44, which was the 98th percentile in quant, and I have 2 or 3 of my students with the exact same breakup, the overall composite would be a 730 or 740, i.e. the 96th or the 97th percentile, right? The reverse would never work. For example, if somebody got a Q51, which was the highest that you could get in quant, and let's say an equivalent of a 59th percentile in verbal, let's say a V30, right? The overall composite would be somewhere around a 660 to 680, right? So the older GMAT definitely favored the verbal section over the quant section. Again, for the very simple reason that most of the test takers will have good percentiles in quant any which way, right? And so will be the case on the focus edition of the GMAT as well. In fact, in some ways, quant becomes easier, right? Because there is no data sufficiency either. It's just problem solving. Plus, there is no geometry, so that also reduces a little bit of the, topic that people found difficult. So the main challenge ultimately is going to be in verbal and data insights, and both of them require very, very solid verbal skills. So A, don't take the exam too lightly. B, don't take the verbal section too lightly, to be more precise. Even in DI and quant, verbal comprehension skills will be tested. And C, do practice until you have written at least 8 or 10 mocks, and ensure that you're able to properly analyze the questions that you get incorrect. So don't just, get a question incorrect, push it to the back of your mind and move on to the next question, thinking ki this one doesn't matter. It may not have mattered as much on the classic GMAT, where you had more questions to play with. On the focus edition, it definitely will matter.
Things to keep in mind for all you folks out there who are preparing for the new GMAT Focus edition. With that, we have come to the end of this amazing conversation. Thank you, Param, for your time.
Thank you, Junaid.
Yes, and thank you all for staying with us. Hope this was helpful to you. With that, this is Junaid signing off. I'll catch you peeps in the next one. Fly high.
Thank you.